Tonight's presentation is by Dr. Denise Burchsted. Dr. Burchsted's an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Studies, Geography, and Sustainability here at Keene State. She's been here since the fall of 2013. She has a PhD in geoscience and a BS in civil engineering from the University of Connecticut, and she has a master's of forestry science degree from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Her classes at Keene State include global environmental change, matter, energy, and the environment, restoration ecology, freshwater science management, and her research is diverse, ranging on articles from snowmelt and stream flow to the impact of beaver dams on geomorphology, dam removal, and professional reports on watershed hydrology. Recently, though, she's been working on looking at racial composition and imbalance in the environmental movement. Her talk tonight is part of that exploration. It's titled, "Why Does the Environmental Movement Look So White?" And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Burchsted, and I will be back at the end to help with questions and to sign us out. So take it away, Denise.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm sharing my screen and I'm about to start the slideshow. So hopefully you will see one slide right now that says, yep. Wonderful. So hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much. I'm actually really delighted to be able to talk to all of you today about this. As Mike mentioned in the introduction, this is not something that is my academic expertise. I'm a physical scientist. I'm an engineer. I study rivers. I study river management. But I have become convinced, despite how fascinating and important my own research is, this is one of the most pressing environmental issues facing us in our time. And so I'm really genuinely delighted to be able to share this information with you today. I'd like to make a couple of acknowledgements as I'm about to embark as a white woman, frankly, talking about race. I want to acknowledge that yesterday in particular was an extremely hard day for a lot of Black people in this country with the Derek Chauvin verdict and the concurrent killing of Ma'Khia Bryant. People are feeling really raw. And so I just want to acknowledge that. And also, I can't see who's here, but if what I'm talking about feels uncomfortable and overwhelming in that way, I welcome people taking care of themselves and checking out. There's a couple of things that I'm going to talk about in here that are extremely uncomfortable. And so I want to point that out right off the bat. And so again, thank you. And the other acknowledgement I'd like to make as I get started is about the land where we're on. I suspect many of you are aware that the indigenous people to this land are the Ubeniki. Here's a drawing from back in the day, just to put some of these words up so people can see them as well. Again, the Ubeniki were here. There's many bands. One of them were the Sokoke, really the southwesternmost group. The Pennacook people also overlap here, and I'd like to acknowledge both of them and really also recognize that this is part of this larger confederacy called Wabanaki. That word Wabanaki means dawn land specifically. This is the land of the confederacy of people where the light first reached. So the Wabanaki Confederacy reaches over to the coast and all the way up down East Maine and into Nova Scotia and Canada, where the first light reaches the continent of North America. They call their land Ndakina. We should not call it Ndakina. It means our land. That's their word for their land. Our land, their land, Ndakina. So just a comment on that word. And we also have very close neighbors and allies to the south with the Pocumtuck. And as I mentioned, back in the day, and there's also the present, it's really important to acknowledge that Indigenous people have been here since time immemorial, is the way they say it here in Keene. That's since the glaciers melted over 12,000 years ago. One of the oldest archaeological sites is in Keene. It's over 12,500 years old. And Indigenous people have occupied this land since then up to the present day. And as I say that, I want to comment the land involves so many things. Oops, this is Marge Bruchek. She wasn't supposed to show up yet. There's a picture of a garden behind her face. But my point here is the land provides for everything: food, medicine, clothing, shelter, as well as much more deep connections. And I want to make one last comment of this land using a quote from Dr. Marge Bruchek regarding this term Wabanaki. Here's how it's also written. That this is like the O with the little hat on it sound. As I mentioned, meaning dawn land, Wabanaki. But this "ak" at the end is a really fascinating language term to think about, because what that word means is a thing that's been made animate. So in the Abenaki, many indigenous languages, there are no genders to the words. There isn't a he, she. It's a living, non-living would be their genders if there's such a thing. So nouns are either animate or inanimate, and inanimate, most things are actually animate. Water is animate, rocks are animate meaning alive. And the land is alive, and the people refer to themselves as the land, Wabanaki, the dawn land, being made animate in many things, plural. So the point that I want to finish here with this land acknowledgement is the people, in their own words, see themselves as the land itself, walking and living and breathing. This is a very deep relationship. This isn't I'm from this place, I occupy this space. It's I am the space. And that is also how a person would refer to themselves. If you ask you, where are you from? They're not from somewhere. They would say in the Abenaki, I am. So if someone were to ask me that, and I spoke Wabanaki, which I don't, I would say, I am keen. So a deep relationship between people and land. And so with that, as I move forward, I'd like to set an intention for the remainder of this talk and for what I'm doing right now as well. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, a biologist, really remarkable professor who's written this spectacular book that I think like everyone in the world should read. And she uses an analogy in this book that I'd like to repeat here as I begin this talk. She talks about the plant plantain, which is nothing like the banana plantain that you might know about. The one she's referring to is a common herb, or herb not in the sense that you might think of, but just a low growing plant that's not a grass. It's usually quite short. You've all seen it, and you might not even recognize it because it's just everywhere. This is a lovely photo of it. These are its flowers. This is a plant that's called the white man's footstep also. It's been called this because it is not native to North America. It came here as the Europeans came here and settled this landscape, and it followed them. It occupies, it grows in land that's been disturbed and ground that's been disturbed and altered, especially by the European colonists and settlers. And yet it's this remarkable, beautiful plant. You might not look at it and think, oh, that's beautiful, but I'm in love with this plant, to be honest. It's a very powerful plant in terms of healing and protecting. As it turns out, it's remarkable in its capacity to heal wounds. I dabble at best in herbs, and this was the very first one I ever used. It's wonderful for like bee stings and ant stings and irritations of your skin. It heals them in a way that's remarkable. So it's a settler, it's a colonizer plant. It's not native to this place, and yet its action is to restore harm to the land. And I'd like to provide this quote from Dr. Kimmerer's book. The way that she describes this, she says, foreign invaders, and for those of you who are familiar with environmental issues, we are so concerned about invasive plants. They take over and they dominate and they destroy native ecosystems. It's very harmful, many of these invasive plants. And these are the ones she's referring to, foreign invaders like loosestrife, kudzu, cheatgrass. They have a colonizing habit of taking over others' homes and growing without regard to limit. But plantain is not like that. Its strategy is to be useful, to fit into small places, to coexist with others around the dooryard, to heal wounds. Plantain is so prevalent, so well integrated, that we think of it as native. And when she's saying we, I think I neglected to mention, Dr. Kimmerer is both a scientist, she's also indigenous. She comes from the Potawatomi people. She's a member of the Potawatomi people. And when she says we in that context, she's referring to indigenous people to this landscape have accepted plantain as a native plant because it's so valuable. Plantain is not indigenous, but naturalized. This is the same term we use for the foreign-born when they become citizens in our country. So I'd like to use that as an intention and a framing for the rest of what I'd like to talk about today. This idea of a plantain that has settled disturbed ground and that works as a salve to heal wounds. Maybe it's an overreach, but it's an intention. So with that, I want to move into the actual topic that I said that I was going to cover, which is talking about race and how people of various racial backgrounds care about the environment or not. And again, I have to do one last sort of acknowledgement before I can really launch into this, which is that race is fake. It's a fake construct. I'm going to use it throughout this talk because it matters a lot, but it's not based in biology. It has been thoroughly debunked. It's been attempted time and time again. It doesn't work. However, there are social classes based on the color of people's skin and other characteristics that are very important. And those are what I'm going to talk about. But I just want to frame again, this has no biological basis. And these categories are arbitrary and they change and their names change and who fits in what changes all the time because of this. And I want to acknowledge there's so many good books on this. This is one that I like, one by Ibram Kendi. It's called Stamped from the Beginning. So here's sort of what was in the topic of my title of my talk. Who cares about the environment? Which racial ethnic groups care most about climate change? There are so many surveys about this. I could bore you to tears with one after another. I've chosen two to show you in this talk. This is one, again, focused on climate change instead of just the environment. And so, you can just answer that question for yourself as you think about what might come up with this survey. Here's what the survey said, what they found. These categories here at the top, we're looking at the Hispanic, Latinx group, Black folks, white folks. This blue bar is showing that 37% of the folks who identified as Hispanic, Latinx called themselves alarmed about climate change. Black folks were 27%, and white folks fell into the smallest category, 22%. We're getting to half of the Hispanic, Latino. I'm lumping myself in with the white category. This green bar is then showing folks who are concerned. And if you look at it from the other end, these brown are dismissive. So the folks who fall into this category of white, both were least concerned and most doubtful and dismissive. And this translates also not just in level of concern, but also likelihood to take action. So again, in order, we're looking at the Hispanic Latinx group at the top and the white at the bottom. The Hispanic folks, again, most likely to take action. This dark green is I'm doing this right now. A smaller percentage of whites are actively engaged in climate change of those surveyed than either the Black folks or the Hispanic Latinx folks. This semi-dark green is I would definitely take action, tell me what to do. And the lighter green is, yeah, I probably would. So once again, not only are the folks who land in the white category least concerned, but also least likely to take action. Again, one study, there's so many. I'm showing one here for this talk. Okay, so I'm gonna just take a guess, because this is normally the case when I talk with folks, and myself included. My perception of who cared about the environment, who cares, did not match. And many folks, I'm sorry, my answering machine's going off in the background at the same time, Zoom lectures. Anyway, my level of concern is, I'm sorry, my perception of level of concern did not, until I saw these surveys, match the reality. And so I want to comment on that, because I was not an outlier. This is another study. This one's published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And what they're doing here is they're surveying a whole bunch of people and lumping them into categories of various kinds. Here's the Latinx category. They're also looking at economic wealth. There's a poor category. There's a wealthy category. Age, older versus younger folks. Here's the younger folks, and gender, a binary gender, and religion. So people, so one person, let's say there's somebody who falls in the Latinx category. Not only are they reporting their own level of concern about the environment, they're also reporting how much they think someone who's poor would care about the environment, and how much they think someone who's Asian would care, and so on. So every person who took this survey reported on how much they think folks in the other categories are concerned. And what you see is almost a perfect mismatch. The folks who care the most are perceived, generally speaking, as caring the least. So poor are expected to care very little, and poor care a great deal. Latinx cared the most, once again, like with the previous study that I showed you. Asians care a great deal. Blacks are perceived similarly as caring very little, and actually caring much more. The one group out there that cares less than people think are the folks who fall in the white category again. So we have this mismatch. There's actual concern, and there's perception of concern. And I want to say something about that for a moment. I want to just ask you, just, check into, with your own mind. When I say, think of an environmental activist, I'm going to guess that a face or two or a name or image will come up in your mind. So think about that. And you can ask Google too. I love doing Google image searches. Let's see what do the interwebs think is somebody. And apparently Greta Tunberg is climate change activist. And there's obviously some other faces, but this is what it looks like to most people. And I'm going to argue that this has a lot to do with the problem of perception, is that there are certain faces and voices that are elevated. But I'd like to show you a couple others. Here's a group, the NAACP is a group of climate change activists, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. People would think of them, I think, as political activists. They care about voting rights. They care a lot about climate change, our communities, our power, advancing resistance and resilience and climate change adaptation, and action toolkit. This isn't even just like education. This is how to take action. This is a problem that's pressing, that the NAACP is arguing and mobilizing to take action on in Black communities. And I want to just toss up a couple of other faces. There's so much to say about all of this, but here's somebody who's a climate scientist. Well, actually not climate, I'm sorry, environmental scientist. Many folks in here would know the name, especially the academics, W.B. Du Bois. He's known as a social scientist. One of his seminal studies is an environmental study, if there ever was one, in environmental racism. We're looking at something that's over 100 years old. This work has been out there. Here's another one, another person, a Black person whose livelihood, whose very survival, livelihood is a much too small of a word, whose absolute existence and survival depended on extensive environmental knowledge. Harriet Tubman, and her environmental knowledge is how she ran the Underground Railroad to help fugitive slaves escape slavery. This is deep, deep environmental knowledge and recognition of the deep ties between environmental knowledge and survival at the most basic level. So just a few faces, just to change your perception of who an environmentalist is. So, okay, I'm gonna say a few things about this. So So Black folks, brown folks care more than white folks. Again, race isn't a real thing. This is stereotypical. When you put it in groups, it still is that way. And still, when you look at the faces, they tend to be white. I'm going to guess, again, I can't presume, but I'm going to guess most folks think of, like, if it's not Greta Tunberg, it's Leo DiCaprio, maybe Al Gore. Those are names that come up a lot. And this is old news. This was a really big deal. I'm going to give a teeny little history lesson here. In 1990, this became very patently obvious to the environmental groups. There was a letter, it's called the SWAP letter, from the name of an organization that was an author, but over 100 folks signed it. This is in the southwestern part of the United States, and they addressed it to the Big Ten. This is the Nature Conservancy, the Sierra Club, names that you've heard of if you hear of environmental groups. They alleged in this letter that there's a history of racist and exclusionary practices. There's a lack of diversity in the conservation organizations and an absolute failure to support environmental justice. And some of the specifics, these folks in the SWAP letter, these community organizations have been working with polluters who are damaging their communities with pollution, but they cannot get the interest of these big green groups. Big green, again, it's like Big Ten. They could not get their interest to help them. These other folks just would not be allies in addressing this. They said, that's not environmental. Dealing with toxic pollution doesn't count. That's not it. They were also actually fighting folks. So the Chicano people in the Southwest, these are, continuing indigenous practices since time immemorial, as I said previously. And now they're actually being attacked by the environmental groups saying they're advocating for the land, when these folks have been doing this for thousands and thousands of years in an ecosystem that's been very sustainable. And so both environmentally questionable and definite problems with social justice. One of the members in this group, the SWAP group, had asked to participate in Earth Day, and this is what's triggered the letter. And the Earth Day folks said, no, the stuff you're working on, that's not part of Earth Day. He was working on groundwater contamination, sewage problems with agribusiness, not the Chicano style, the indigenous style grazing, but the industrial style. This was a big deal, and people heard. The environmental communities were rocked, and they were very upset to recognize that they were racist in their practice. There's no other words to use for that. They were, and they stepped up. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but they all responded. I just have this up here for this quote, that this kickstart, our environmental justice program, in this case at the Sierra Club, was kickstarted by this. People really responded. So thank goodness, that was in 1990. People really stepped it up, right? So we don't have to worry about this anymore, except that's not true. This problem, we are still here. This is a problem that is not going away. And frankly, I'm going to show you a couple things. It might even be getting worse. Dr. Dorcetta Taylor, a remarkable sociologist, one of many things that she's done, her face will show up again in this talk, had surveyed environmental organizations. She did this in 2014 to find out what their diversity of staff was. This is 2014. This is for science. This is the modern day. This is just 6 years ago. This is well after 1990 in that letter that I just showed you. And still less than 5% of the members of the board of conservation organizations are people of color, when the number is 40% of the population. They're doing better when they're bringing in interns, but these interns aren't being hired as staff. And again, they're not, you're looking at people who are on the low rung, and they're not liking the culture. And this is very modern news. This just was, if you paid attention to the literature, the news in this environmental justice, last year was insane. And it was totally unrelated to George Floyd. No, there was a lot that was related to the racial reckoning started by George Floyd, but this stuff was happening separately. open letter to the Union of Concerned Scientists, lots of trouble. This was a long letter by a woman who quit out of incredible frustration with the culture. The Audubon Society is having lots of problems. Woods Hole is a really incredibly important environmental science organization, a preponderance of overt racism. This is not like, you know, a few, like somebody slipped and said the wrong thing. Overt racism is overt. It's happening in public, and there's a lot of it. And it's affecting policy. So here we are, December 2020, the climate policy of cap and trade is accused of environmental racism, and it's coming from this lack of representation in these decisions as they're being made. You're still having the folks making these decisions, making them from a very, very small perspective, a non-inclusive perspective. I'm going to give one more example about this erasure. Again, I want to convince you that this is not, you know, none of this stuff got fixed with Martin Luther King. None of this stuff got fixed in 1990 when people did all this work. This is a very, very current thing, and people don't even recognize it. This is an example here of a photo that was taken in 2020 at a Young Leaders Climate Summit. And the person who took this photo actually took this photo at the bottom and chose to crop out the face of the woman who's leading 2 youth movements across an entire continent. This young woman, Vanessa Naacp, is organizing youth movements about climate change for the continent of Africa. And it was considered that she was kind of messing with the composition. This was a better photo and is the one that was sent out on the AP. And so I just want to comment on these names and show you these faces. These people, Greta Tunberg, very important, really organizing youth climate movement across the continent, which spread worldwide. Vanessa Naacp, a young woman organizing climate action across an entire continent and worldwide. All right, so what is going on here? Why is this, like, why are we here? Why am I doing this in 2021 when I'm a physical scientist? I study rivers. I want to go wander around and get wet and like look at beaver dams and take underwater video of fish and talk about mussels. And here I am doing this now too. So what's going on? And this is the part where it gets very uncomfortable for me to talk about. Again, Dr. Dorcetta Taylor has written on this. She's written a book on it, The Rise of the Conservation Movement, American Conservation Movement. Wonderful, very dry, scholarly book, incredibly dense and full of information. And so I just want to, this is a book that I haven't mentioned yet. I'll mention it later, but a book I'm going to mention later has this quote in it, that we need to talk about this history. This history is casting a long shadow that is affecting us today. This person here in a survey had said that we need to broaden the environmental movement to include the great diversity of the national population. That requires a full reckoning with this history. And I just want to put this up again because I'm going to say a couple things that feel really uncomfortable for me to say. I don't like them. And I have a feeling that other folks are going to feel uncomfortable too. And they need to be said. And I think they need to be talked about much more often in the environmental movement. So I'm going to start with a couple little things of history. One is regarding the Wildlife Conservation Society, Wilderness, I keep calling it Wildlife, Wilderness Conservation Society. Among all the stuff that came out that was sparked by the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning following, a lot of environmental organizations released statements, and they have, like any one of them, we could go down that hole. I'm choosing this one because of a couple of reasons. One is it took them just over 100 years to release a public apology for putting a young man, this man's name is Oda Benga, in 1914 or 16, now I'm blanking on the date, early 1900s, the Bronx Zoo put this man in the zoo. They put him in the monkey cage at the zoo for display. It wasn't a good idea. People did not like it. Well, let me be clear. White people thought it was fine. And there's you can read the editorial in the New York Times defending what a good idea this was. Black people were not at all impressed and acted very, very hard. It took about 2 weeks and they were able to get him released from his zoo prison from being on display. He was a pygmy man. He was kidnapped from Africa and then, put on display. It took until 2020 for the Wilderness Conservation Society to apologize for this. It was done on July 29th. If you go to the Bronx Zoo, so the Wilderness Conservation Society runs the Bronx Zoo. If you go there, though, at least at last record report from a friend of mine, there is still no mention there. If you go there, that's just this one statement is all that's come out. And it goes deeper than this, and I'm going to just stick with the Wilderness Conservation Society. Oh, it's wildlife. I get it mixed up. There we go. I said it right the first time. Wildlife Conservation Society. Their founder, they also apologized for their founder, one of their primary founders, Madison Grant. And some of you may recognize this guy's name, Madison Grant, for reasons that will come up probably on the next slide, probably not for the reasons here. He, though, in his time, was a primary thinker and leader of the environmental movement, and especially the conservation movement at that time. He's currently unsung, and it is, I'm fairly confident, because he also did another really remarkable thing, which is write a manifesto of white supremacy. And I'm going to say the word Adolf Hitler, and I'm not saying that trivially. This book was seminal to the Nazis, and Madison Grant received a letter from Adolf Hitler saying, "Thank you, your book is my Bible." This is not trivial. The level of eugenics and white supremacy that was baked in to the early conservation movement cannot be understated. And again, those words are really hard to say. They're really hard to hear. And I think it's essential that we reckon with them. I want to make a couple more comments about Madison Grant. Here's an ad for his book. This is the publisher. They've got 4 books that they're selling. This up here in the top right corner is the blurb for his book. It's written by at that point, former President Teddy Roosevelt. And this is what Teddy Roosevelt has to say about a book of white supremacy that was a Bible to Adolf Hitler. I don't even want to read the whole thing. It's very uncomfortable. It grasps facts our people need to realize. A subject of most commanding importance, fearlessness. It assails the popular and mischievous sentimentalities and attractive and corroding falsehoods, which few men dare assail. What he's saying is that there's a lot of people who thinks this eugenic stuff is nonsense and garbage. This was not something that everybody accepted. In fact, people were not fearless enough at assailing the popular and mischievous sentimentalities. In other words, people thought that like maybe all humans were equal, kind of like basic humanity at the time. And a few folks did not. And our former president, Theodore Roosevelt, felt that a book that laid out the case for white supremacy was something that all Americans should be sincerely grateful for. This is very hard. This is very uncomfortable. I don't like talking about it. My heart is literally pounding because I feel so uncomfortable. But again, I think we need to reckon with this. We need to reckon with how our lands, our conservation was created and for what purpose and in what way. I'm going to say one more comment on this, and then I'll move to things that feel less uncomfortable. One of Teddy Roosevelt is a very important name for forming the national parks. And he also is associated with the formation of the national forests. Those lands of our parks and forests are on indigenous land. They're taken. And here's the way that Black Elk, who was a very important spiritual leader for the Oglala Sioux, his way of viewing this is that they, and I'm playing this animation down here in the corner of the loss of land over time, they have made little islands for us, the indigenous people, those are the Indian reservations, and other little islands for the four-leggeds, which would be the animals. And always these islands are becoming smaller. This is hard to reckon with. And I'm remembering right now, I had wanted to put a film clip in here, and I will refer to it since I don't have it here. But there's a beautiful film clip from Wampanoag Man. Wampanoag are the people who greeted the first people off the Mayflower. They're still here. A Wampanoag Man referring to, so how do we live as good neighbors? This is where we are today, and I want to go back to the plantain metaphor. This is the situation we have. There's open, raw wounds. And his words felt like that salve that I'm looking for. How do we live as good neighbors? And so I'd like to close this part about the taking of lands for the sake of conservation with that question. How do we live as good neighbors? Indigenous people are still here. Settlers are very much still here. And we are neighbors. All right, so why? I asked this question before and I gave you a history lesson. I could ask this, I could answer this exact same question 100 different ways based on the work that I've been doing most recently. So I answered it once with a history lesson. We've got a history that we are not willing to reckon with. I'm asking you in this Zoom call right now to reckon with it. And it's so hard, like my heart was literally pounding like I'm having like I've got to run from a bear kind of feeling. This is not easy to answer. There's some other whys as well. I'm going to ask this question a couple more times. So what's going on, right? If we want to fix the environment, if we want to fix the, well, I don't know what that means, fix the environment, that's a terrible phrase. If we want to address environmental problems, let's say climate change, if we want to address them, don't we want the people who care the most and who are most likely to take action to be doing it, to be leading the charge, and the people, frankly, who are most likely to be affected? And I didn't show those studies, but again, study after study after study shows that Black people, Hispanic, Latinx people are the most likely to be harmed by the coming climate events. So we're also talking about the people who are most vulnerable. Shouldn't they be the ones? Now, why is it that the white people, the ones who care the least likely to take action, not the individuals again, but the group as a whole is the one that's represented? All right, here's another one. So again, until even, I looked at these data, I made this slide about 6 months ago, and frankly, I shocked myself. I made this slide because I wanted to know how much things have gotten better in the academic field of environmental science. So what I'm showing here is data that's compiled by the National Science Foundation. And what they do is they ask people who've graduated with a PhD, in this case in the year 2018, which was the most recent year when I did this. They've asked all those people, what degree did you get? And they asked them some demographic information like race. So I looked at the data showing all of the sciences that I would lump as field science, that requires you to be outside doing something outside. So some of them are, the animal sciences. A lot of these are environmental sciences. There's some geology in here as well. And then what I did is I broke it out by folks who were US citizens. So they're already in this country and they're reporting race. This red color, which you don't see at all, represents the folks who were American Indian or Alaska Native. If you look super close and squint, you can see there's one person over here who got a degree in geophysics, who identified as American Indian. I think there's one other somewhere. Here it is, Ocean and Marine Sciences. This gray bars and the number next to it are showing the number of folks who were Black who received a PhD in 2018 in these fields. I can't tell you, I still can't tell you how shocked I am to see this. My research, my master's degree is in effectively ecology. In 2018, out of over, and I've got windows here that are blocking my view, so I apologize. You might see my cursor flinging around because I'm moving windows around. But so we had almost, over 350 degrees were awarded to people in ecology, and of those, 0 were awarded to Black students. In a different year, there were like 2. There were 4, 4 and like you're talking about, like, you could have a car of folks going to a conference, get in an accident, and you would wipe out all of the Black students engaged in field science for that, in that year, working on their PhD for that year. These numbers are just alarming to me anyway. So just to put the number on it, of that year in these categories, Black people received less than 2% of the PhDs. 0.1% were awarded to American Indian Alaskan Natives. That's this AIAN. This is far less than the numbers for PhDs, much less. And of course, similarly, the number of PhDs is much less than the number that does not represent these races in the US population. All right, so again, what's going on? Here's one. There's so many of these, I can't even begin. If you want to see racial porn, go to Twitter and you can find it on stories like these. They happened a lot, especially in 2020. Here we go, this is November 2020. People were doing a lot of campaigns on Twitter, like Black in Science, Black in STEM, Black in Nature. There were lots of weeks, so you could go there and read these stories. Here's a person who's, you can just read story after story, a Black woman, being denied entrance into the conference where she's a keynote speaker. Women, especially Black women, not being able to get their mail, being accosted, people being accosted by the cops, by security. It just goes on and on and on. In this case, it's not only this professor, but also their trainees, not like their students aren't being able to get into the lab. They're being accosted by security. I have had environmental, I've been afraid for my life in the field. I'm a short woman. I've been in the field by myself on more than one occasion and realized this is a stupid idea. I am potentially risking my life right now doing this science, and my science isn't worth my life. I have had moments of like, oh, I'm in danger because of who I am, because I'm white, because I'm white, because I'm a woman. But I have never, just the level of challenge to your existence is a whole different thing. And again, the stories don't end. I want to highlight one of my many favorite nature writers. Drew Lanham is a Black bird watcher. He's got one of his many things that he's written, and my gosh, I think everyone should read everything the man has ever written, of many folks. I put 4 up here just to give you a sense of what this means. To be a person who's a scientist, Professor and Dr. Drew Lanham, as I should have mentioned. He's a professor. He's a superb birder, and these are things that a white birder does not need to do. You do not need the photo ID to convince the cops, FBI, Homeland Security, and flashlight-toting security guard that you're not a terrorist or escaped convict. And he says this tongue-in-cheek and 100% serious. You just can't do the things that other people do. The level of stress to just be outside in nature, if you're not a white man, is a very different level of stress. I can attest to some of it as a woman. But again, I have not, I have been in places where I was like, oh no, the cop is going to ask me what the hell I'm doing here. And you know what? The cop comes up and asks me what the hell am I doing? And I'm like, I'm looking at the river because I'm doing this, and everything's fine. It doesn't go that way. If you're not white, it's just, there's a very unequal level of stress that's going on here. All right, one more comment about being outside. I'm going to move from environmental field science to a slightly related topic in environmental studies. I'm going to move to land ownership. Another one, like things are getting better, right? Aren't things getting better? What this graph is showing is ownership of farmland according to race. So this bluish color is showing, and it's in a percentage because it's relative to 1910, right? So sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less compared to 1910. White farmers, you know, it bounces around. It's more or less stayed the same. Black farmers is not. Black farmers, and this is another misperception, there's so few of them. Many people have a perception that Black people don't really like farming, do they? And nothing could be further from the truth. Black farmers are having their lands effectively taken away from them. And so I'm going to put up this like clip from Wikipedia. I know it's Pigford versus Glickman right now. It's a class action lawsuit against the United States government, alleging racial discrimination against African-American farmers. And look at these years, 1981 to 1996. The largest civil rights settlement to date is compensating Black farmers for the loss of land due to racist practices going on at the USDA. And if folks want to understand exactly how that works, I'd be happy to explain it. So far, almost $1 billion has been paid or credited. Now, this goes from 1981 to 1996, so things are better, right? And they're not. The same practices are continuing, and there's a lot of documentation on this. So I just want to comment again, like these perceptions of what it's like to be a Black person in nature are often mistaken. I want to call out some really good work that people are doing in the Northeast. There's a farm in New York State, Soulfire Farm, that's working very hard on both Black farming and generating food sovereignty. There's a Farmers of Color Land Trust. There's so much, there's just so much, but just a couple points about Black people in nature, both as a scientist. I haven't talked about recreation. Stories are very similar. And here's an example of farming, of agriculture. All right, so here we go again. So why? I think I'm going to need to leave it on this slide here, on this last point here, even though I have like 15 more slides. But I'm going to do this. This will be my last why. I had commented on this book Dr. Carolyn Finney wrote. It's called Black Faces, White Spaces. She's talking much more about the recreational aspect of it. And in this book, she did a few social scientific studies that are presented in this book. One of them, she surveyed environmental professionals. She surveyed some who are white, some who are Black, on what their experience is like as an environmental professional. These are people who are engaged in the profession, who very much love it, who chose it for their career. And she asked these people, why is it that there's so few Black people outside? And particularly in regard to the national parks, there's very, very limited use of the national parks by Black folks. Here's what the Black environmental professionals said. Well, some of what they said. One of the things they said was, and this isn't a majority, but it's a significant minority. Over a third of them said that there are exclusionary practices at the parks and in other outdoor recreational areas. And it's the exclusionary practices that are a primary reason that Black people don't feel comfortable being outside in these places, like the national parks. And, somebody said here, just as an example of a comment, no one tried to engage us in the conservation movement. Nobody's reaching out to us. All right. So here, that's an example of what Black folks said. Here's an example of what white folks said. In her case, all of the people she surveyed were at the National Park Service because she had a big enough sample size. There were so few Black employees at the National Park Service, she had to expand that to include other environmental professionals. But white employees of the National Park Service, over a third didn't even answer the question. They just skipped it. They had no idea, couldn't even begin to decide whether exclusionary practices were a thing. And in addition to that, over a half so many, 2/3 answered, the vast majority of those who answered said, exclusionary practices, that is not a thing. That's either not an issue or it's definitely the least important issue. White folks don't see it at all. They don't see this thing happening. That over a third of the Black folks are saying this is the primary problem. An example of a response was like, where does this even come from? So there's this massive chasm of understanding. So again, another plea that I'm making to the environmental community, we got to reckon with our history in the environmental community, and we got to start talking about different experiences according to race. Oops. All right. So similarly, Dr. Finney interviewed folks to ask them, what's the problem? And this is a fascinating thing. I've sort of done my own informal anecdotal survey because I start telling the information that's in this that I've been showing so far to my colleagues, and they will tell me what the problem is. They know, my white colleagues, and I'm afraid to myself and my white colleagues, we don't, because the things that they say are not the things that when I talk to my Black colleagues, they're like, oh yeah, here's what it is. It's racism. And I have yet to talk to a white colleague to explain some of this information. They're like, well, yeah, I mean, of course, because we're racist. It's not overt, although at Woods Hole, I did say it was actually overt. But by and large, this word racist is so loaded and people respond with such anxiety when it's being said. And yet the Black folks who are experiencing this are like, that's what this is. And if you want to fix it, you're gonna need to address it. And after that, there's a lack of willingness to work together. There's a lack of awareness of differences in cultures. There's just the cluelessness. And I mean, I'm going to put myself in that category. Like, I just get lost in my own world and I don't reach out to people. So they look exclusionary. This one, number 5, is a very common one that I'll hear from my colleagues, from my white colleagues. Unequal power and funding, absolutely. And this one too, I hear a lot. It's a very real thing. Many Black kids don't even know that, like, you can do that for a job. Like, you could go around and look at birds and be somebody who does that. So there's also there's some other structural problems that again, my white colleagues are ready to identify and get to work on. When people cause harm, there's very little to no accountability, and there's a very fractured culture in general. And I just own that one myself. I'm happy to work in my own little bubble. So these are the things that we need to address. We, the environmental community. This is if we want to get to work. Here's a list. Here's a to-do list. Let's get to work. We need to get working on these things. I think what I'm going to do is skip ahead to a slide because I do want to mention Chris Schell, who is a really, really brilliant young ecologist. And here's how he concluded a talk about this. He says it so much better than I do.
And the positive of all of it is that even in all of this doom and gloom, in the final battle against Thanos, we have the ability to make it happen. We really do. It just takes a little bit of effort to think outside of ourselves, to think compassionately, to center folks of color and especially women of color in these narratives, and to center indigenous traditional ecological knowledge as well as community knowledge, right? We all have a role and a part to play in this narrative. And if we all get a chance to play that role, then we can come out of this story with a Hamilton.
So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to find my slide with the plantain, and there was a question that popped in early, and I just steamrolled ahead. So I'm ready to go to questions.
Sure.
Sure.
Hi, Denise. I just want to say before we get to the questions that we have this particularly unsatisfying moment at the end of all these talks, because they're on Zoom and they're terrific talks and really eye-opening, where there's no applause while I talk about what a great talk that was. But believe me, there's affirming applause out there. That was really terrific. You hit a lot of points, and it was very eye-opening to me. And I do want to get to questions. And you mentioned there was one in the Q&A that you already see. And I think it's this one. Is it possible that agribusiness stopped in the 1990 environmental movement, since they tend to squash anything that challenges them? I think that's in the context of an earlier piece that you were talking about, but do you want to talk a little bit about that? And other questions, please start entering or raising your hands, panelists and attendees.
Yeah, oh my gosh, that's a great question. I'm not going to get it exactly right. I'll guarantee you that, because that's not my field of expertise. But I will say that traditionally agribusiness and the environmental movement are enemies. So to the sense that there was, if I understood the question correctly, it was sort of like, were they like kind of working together? Actually, could you read again? Let me make sure I understood it correctly.
Sure. Is it possible that agribusiness stopped on the 1990 environmental movement, suppressed it, since they tend to suppress anything that challenges them?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And absolutely. Right. For starters, sure. The agribusiness is always stomping on the environmental movement, not just in the 90s, like all the time. Yeah. And the environmental movement, as I started saying earlier, is very much opposed to agribusiness almost exclusively. So that's going on. In terms of the racial aspect, though, no, that's not what was happening. What was happening is the environmental movement was just insensitive to what was happening in the communities of color due to the fact that they were almost exclusively white. And there's a perception, oh God, there's so much to like tease out of this, but there's a perception that came out of that very early eugenics-based conservation that nature is wild. That I'm going to say something that's almost heresy. It's going to shock people, but wilderness is a fake construct, just like race. It's not a thing. People have populated the globe everywhere. If you find a large area without people, it's because somebody has taken the people out. It requires removal of indigenous people to get wilderness. And yet much of the conservation movement is based in this, like, I mean, you might even like come to mind immediately, like quotes about wildness and wilderness and what it does for your spirit and all that. I mean, which isn't to say that indigenous managed landscapes don't have that sense of wilderness. But there's a sense that like in the early conservation movement that, and which continued well into 1990s and still exists in many places today, that nature is something over here that we protect and we keep separate from people who are over here. And that it might need to be done with our modern industrial extractive society, which will damage the land, but the indigenous people don't live that way on the land. And so that paradigm is very, very complicated. And that's what was going on in the 90s anyway. It was not the agribusiness aspect of it. I hope I answered that question. It was a lot that I just pulled in.
It was very interesting, though. It was a good answer. Carrie, you've got Carrie Cowich. She's here and you can unmute.
Sure. Denise, thank you so much for a enlightening but very sobering talk, and certainly, as you mentioned, so important that we engage in these difficult conversations, right, and come to the middle place around how we've landed here. But would love to, I've known you for a while and have known you to have lots of passion in the field of ecology, but your passion around this particular aspect of ecology seems relatively new formed. And I would love to hear a little bit about what brought you to this place.
Wow, that's a great question. I actually had pondered whether I should be introducing some of that right in the beginning. So thank you. I'm you asked me that, so I can I can do that. Yeah, so if you heard in Mike's introduction, it was kind of sneaked in there, which is this restoration ecology. And that's really my professional identity, is working in the field of ecological restoration. So all of those parts, like the dam removal as an engineer, is about restoring rivers. The wandering around and loving to look at beaver dams, again, is about understanding natural rivers, to think about them as a baseline for what rivers could and should be restored to. And so what happened to me is I was working as a professional engineer. I lived a whole other life before I did this one. I was a consulting engineer. I took out dams and did some other work related to that. Well, I didn't use the sledgehammer. I did the stuff in the office. So I didn't really, anyway, but I did the engineering to take out dams. And as I did that, I realized two things. One is that I needed to get my PhD because I needed to understand rivers better, and I needed to understand the baseline condition. And the other is that the baseline condition, so this term I keep saying, baseline condition, that's a very specific ecological term about what the ecosystem looked like before it was dramatically altered. And I realized that that baseline condition included people. And that rocked my world. And this was 20 years ago now, but it rocked my world in a pretty big way. And so I've been working kind of, on the DL. How are people integrated into the ecosystem? And I've been doing this for a long time, in much more subtle ways. But what's happened now, as I've been exploring this role of humans as part of the baseline ecosystem, I did not know until this past year, until I got educated by social media, frankly, the racial history. I knew about the indigenous history, and I knew about indigenous people, and and I've done some of the work, like at the college. A student who worked with me helped implement the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution. So this aspect of acknowledging the indigenous role in rivers is something, and landscapes is something I've always been working on. But I frankly had no idea, and I'm kind of angry. Like, I'm actually genuinely angry. I went, for example, as Mike mentioned in my introduction, I went to the Yale School of Forestry. It was founded by Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot was a white supremacist. I never knew. I did not know that until in this past year. And that is like, I feel betrayed. I'm going to be honest. Like that is really, really upsetting to know that the people who have been portrayed as heroes and leaders of thought, I would in no way want to follow in their footsteps. That's not to dismiss everything, right? As always, there's knowledge, and you can't just be like, well, never mind the knowledge. But how the knowledge was generated and the thought processes behind it seem essential. The process of knowledge generation is required to understand how we got where we are and what we're doing and how we're implementing what we know. And I've never heard of Madison Grant. I never knew that, et cetera. I didn't know the biggest civil rights suit ever is over farms. So so again, this is to finally get back to your question. This is driven by that understanding of ecosystems. Humans are a fundamental part of ecosystems, and how do we live with the ecosystem in a way that's sustainable as part of that restoration ecology?
Thanks, Denise.
I think Larry's got his hand
Yep,
up.
there's Larry. Okay.
Denise, I just want to thank you so much. This has just been really enlightening and terrific. I want you to know that just a few minutes ago, if you saw me go off with my phone, I got a call from my daughter, and I quickly told her, oh, I'm in this lecture that Denise Burchsted is doing, and I told her what the topic was. And my daughter, who's now just turned 25, was an intern for the Sierra Club in Oakland, California, at their headquarters. And my daughter was offered a job with the Sierra Club after college, which she turned down to become I don't know what she does. But she said, yeah, Dad, it's a bunch of old white guys who run that place. There's no Black people in that place. She said, yeah, she's right. It's a racist organization. Out of the mouths of my young daughter. I just wanted to say that because it's to reinforce your message. But It's true. It's just what you're saying is true. The other thing I got to thinking about was that the social capital that builds up in colleges, right? So from Bennington College, they have all these connections. You can go to the Sierra Club, right? And go fly to Oakland, and they'll find an alumna that you can live with, and you can go work for the Sierra Club, right? That's an opportunity my kid had. The next year, she wanted to go to Africa and work in a township. Bennington College had no connections, but Sky Stevenson at Keene State College hooked me up with a group in Cape Town. And I sent my daughter, we worked it out with the college, with Bennington College. So I'm wondering, you talk about this sort of systemic racism, is that maybe the door is open. Look, NPR, if you go to an elite college, you can get, they'll have a contact at NPR, and then you can eventually become one of their staff. Although a Keene State student of mine is now a top NPR staff person. But you know what I'm saying? Is social capital at elite, or at least at colleges, part of the issue here?
Oh, totally, 100%. Yeah, and it's a great question, because you underlined that slide of my so why, and one of the reasons why I was showing that PhD slide. But that point of that PhD slide is it, and you watch if you again, there's just so much of this data that's been collected of students who are interested. They, it's just this just fall off the cliff with especially Black students, less so, but also Hispanic, Latinx students, very interested as they start their undergrad. They don't get their undergrad degree, and then as you go into higher and higher levels of education, the numbers just drop dramatically. And so there's this systemic racism that manifests in so many different ways, and I suggested a couple of them in my talk. And that's exactly what happens. Then they don't have PhDs, they don't get hired into the positions that can build that culture, to provide the mentoring, to change the system as a whole. Yeah, and that gets absolutely tied up with exactly what you were talking about, the lack of social capital. Very much so.
I did one other thing, which is, while you were talking, I Googled, I didn't know this. What percentage are there of PhD psychologists? How many PhD psychology professors are there? Oh my gosh, it's only 1% of my field of clinical psychologists. That's grossly underrepresented. I didn't know until you gave your talk, and it compelled me to check it out.
I'm so delighted you did that, because what happened to me is I saw somebody's tweet, and he was saying in 2015, I was one of 2 Black guys. I was like, well, it must be better by now. And there was 0. There were 2 in 2015, and there were 0. And again, I didn't know. And I'm and this is, back to that, I'm angry about this. I really feel betrayed. And I also I'm frustrated that I went through my PhD program and my master's program, and I really wasn't I wonder why we're all white. It just didn't even register. It didn't even, I just didn't even ask the question. I mean, I'm sure if somebody had pointed something out, I'd been like, oh yeah, we're all white. I wasn't totally stupid, but I really didn't think about it in any substantive way. And it's not addressed. It's, and there's the ways that it's being addressed now are kind of like that slide I showed with all the interns, right? People are being brought in, but they're being put in toxic situations with leadership that doesn't understand how to mentor people of color and what the issues are that they're facing. And so they're not, you're not growing the diversity of the field. Yeah, anyway, I could go on.
Well, yeah, you could go on, and you've got me going on. I mean, and just one last thing, as I looked, the top 10 psychology programs in the country: Harvard University, University of Pennsylvania, University of Minnesota, all of them have 0 Blacks right now on their psychology departments. 0.
Right.
I was like, what? Right. I just go look at it right now. I mean, that's so hard to anyway, you could go on and on and on. Sure. So it's not just the environmental.
No. We are remarkably bad in the field sciences, though. I will say. But yeah, there are others. I think I saw a list, and it wasn't parsed out by exact fields, but the field sciences were second last only to like nuclear technicians, I think was the lowest diversity in the STEM fields. And I'm not sure if the list I was looking at included psychology. Yeah.
So we have a question from Wes Martin. He's wondering, can you give us an overview of differences between the research subjects of racial groups? I guess the research interests and areas.
I think so. Wes, do you mean like people who are scientists who are studying to be scientists?
Yes, you can go ahead and unmute, Wes.
Yeah, thank you. Really lovely presentation. Hot damn, like we're lucky to have you. As Sarah says so too, Antioch is really great loss. She's in the kitchen. So I'm interested in whether or not there are systematic differences in what people look at, think is probably worth studying when we look at these quote-unquote racial groups. And so are we looking at one set and is another group looking at another set? And should we be paying attention to the difference?
Yeah, keep going. Explain a little bit more. I think I understand what you mean, but keep going if you don't mind.
So the research priorities of non-white groups, of indigenous groups, should alert us to what is important to the people who are going to be making a difference. Awesome.
Yes. I glossed over this slide, but maybe I'll go back to it. This might be the example of what you're talking about. I think it was Dr. Chris Schell, who's the one who I read that tweet that made me make that graph from 2018, but I couldn't find it. Anyway, he's a young academic, recently got his PhD, I think it was 2015. And he's doing groundbreaking work in ecology and evolutionary biology, looking in urban environments in ways that the white ecologists just don't even think to ask these questions. Is that what you're talking about, Wes? Am I in the?
Yeah, and so I would be looking for systematic differences.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this would be one that I would
racial groups.
Yeah, and I would point to this one immediately, is that white folks will study systems that are in beautiful remote wilderness places, and that's what ecology is, right? It's set in these other, and I mean, I do it too, and there's a good reason, right? Because it's a beautiful place to be, and why wouldn't you get paid to go to a gorgeous place and learn something about it? But there's very little on urban systems. And this is something that's actually incredibly interesting to me here in Keene, because we have a super interesting river systems that I won't begin to babble on about, super interesting urban river systems, and it's totally unstudied. We have really high diversity of fish in Beaver Brook, like it's a ditch, and there's all kinds of reasons why that I'd love to explore, but a lot of it has to do with this dismissal of urban as junk, and an automatic assumption, that assumption I was talking about earlier, that if people are involved, it must be bad and it must be causing harm. And so there's this bias that's immediately laid on top of environmental science, that if humans are involved, it's bad. And so that immediately like erases most of indigenous knowledge and most of indigenous land management, which actually has developed over millennia to create sustainable systems. So we do it at our peril as well. There's this base understanding of how to be part of the system, right? That, as I mentioned earlier, the people are the land walking. They're the land alive and breathing. That's how they perceive themselves. And so they interact with the land in a way that develops the whole body. And I don't want to over noble indigenous people. They do terrible, stupid things too, because humans do terrible, stupid things. We like that. But the paradigm sets it for the potential for a really different outcome, and definitely not inherently people bad. And believe it or not, it's not even cities bad. It often, like, cities do a lot of bad things, right? But it doesn't have to be that way, and there's a lot to learn from these other systems.
Very cool. So your baseline condition, which included people for most of the world, includes non-white people
And white people.
Yeah, but but we're not looking at the non-white people who are the majority of the world.
Correct.
And so
Yeah.
that's the baseline ecological condition that we're not looking at.
Correct. Yeah, I agree completely, 100%. And there's a lot of problems that evolve out of that, especially with conservation and the export of this idea of conservation being necessary to protect nature from humans. So one of the things that's happening now is, as the American idea, the US American idea of conservation is being exported internationally, Indigenous people are being kicked off their land at increasing rates. So it's some of these, and it actually turns out that it's very closely related to, or inversely related to gross national product. So the poorer the country, the more land that's being taken for conservation, and the greater the population of Indigenous people that are currently being dispossessed of their land as a result of this like misperception of how humans interact with the landscape, and automatically saying humans must be causing harm. Yeah.
Thanks, Wes. We have a question from Mark Long, and he's among our attendees, but I've opened your mic if you want to turn it on and talk.
Thanks, Denise. Wonderful. I'll second what Wes said. Just fabulous. To your point about, I'm thinking about Ken Burns's National Parks, America's Best Idea. And if you got, I actually have in front of me what they write in terms of I don't know who's seen this film, and I don't remember exactly when it was put out, but I'm thinking about erasure and the erasure of people and land, and particularly, as you were just saying, the exportation of this idea, this best idea. Let me just read the last sentence. So he says, this is nonetheless, America's Best Idea is nonetheless a story of people from every conceivable background, rich and poor, famous and unknown, soldiers and scientists, natives and newcomers, artists and entrepreneurs, who are willing to devote themselves to saving some precious portion of the land they love, and in doing so, reminded their fellow citizens of the full meaning of democracy. Now, the irony of that is painful. And this is the narrative, right? This is the broad narrative that we share, and which you're pointing out is an illusion, because it's not the full meaning of democracy. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So it's just, the indicators of this are everywhere, but I was just, when I was thinking about this, I went back to this, and I had discovered this on my own and thought, God, this is so tragic that this is how this idea is being presented. And I experienced this firsthand in 2008 when I went to India, and I was thinking about the tiger preserves and how important they were, but also in order to create them, as you pointed out, people had to be removed. So is that the best idea? So it's just a comment, but again.
Oh, it's a great comment. That was a beautiful quote. I want to, if you wouldn't mind sending it to me, I'd love to have a copy of it. It actually, like, literally, like, I feel it. It's like, it doesn't feel good. I feel it like inside, listening to that. And it's true. Actually, it was kind of interesting because I just shared an article with one of the environmental studies seminars about Madison Grant, actually, especially, and asked students, like, what do you think, like, what do you disagree with in this article? And I actually was fishing. I wanted people to be like, well, come on, Teddy Roosevelt was a great president. Like, I wanted some pushback like that, which nobody wanted to push back on, just because I think we need to, really work through this in a serious, genuine way. But I had like several students responded, they, did a little homeworky thing beforehand. And several were like, I disagree with the idea that that the parks are America's best idea. So maybe it was because they read the article, I'm assuming, and not because they felt that way beforehand. But yes, I think it's a really important point. The parks, the creation of the parks is partly a way to sell the taking of the land from the indigenous people of the United States. And I'm going to say another one that, I mean, I just feel like I'm like full of arrows to shoot at people. I don't know if anybody wants to be my friend. Maybe I don't have very many friends right now, but land grant universities. This is what land grant universities are as well. So the academics on this call know that phrase. The students probably may have heard it, but might not know what it means. But the idea is that I think there's one in every state. There's a land grant university the land was granted to the institution of higher education. In New Hampshire, our land grant university is the University of New Hampshire. Now, all of the land grant universities have received significant funding from Indigenous land, even if they're not located on Indigenous land. So the land was taken and from the Western, right? I just mentioned the University of New Hampshire. So I don't know the exact spots, but you can actually look it up. Many lands out West were given as part of the land grant to the University of New Hampshire. And what the University of New Hampshire has been doing since then is selling those lands to fund the endowment. And this is what's funded the land grant, a major part of it. It's not all of it, obviously, but it's an important part of the land grant system of colleges. So the creation of the parks and the creation of this higher educational system of flagship state institutions across the country are being used as to help people feel good about the taking of the land from the indigenous people in the West. And as that quote from Teddy Roosevelt that I showed you sort of gets at, a lot of people didn't like it. It was not super popular to shove all the people out West onto these tiny little patches of land. There was a lot of opposition to that idea.
So I guess that I have an observation from my own past that you've sparked, and that is that I was an intern in the mid 80s with the National Wildlife Federation in DC. And it was a very gender diverse group of interns working there at that time, but it was not racially diverse at all. And that's something we may have felt at the time, but it's something that you point out quite acutely. There's another one, and that is that as a young engineer, my job, like yours, was to go around fixing mistakes that people had made. Dams that maybe shouldn't have built. I closed landfills and I helped ameliorate toxic waste sites and things like that. And so I guess maybe one of the things that strikes me is your work is continuing a little bit in that vein. You seem to want to continue to correct mistakes that people in their approach to the environment that we've got in our history. This is a different one, but it is an important one. And I wonder if you feel the same sort of professional satisfaction in the work that you're doing now as you did, with the dam work and the river restoration work.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm also feeling sensitive. I think I've gone over time, so I just want to be clear that if people want to leave, I won't be insulted if you're like, thanks, that was great, but I gotta go. But I also want to answer your question. So just before I babble on, I just want to create that obvious invitation for people to leave if you need to. Yes, and it's still very much a part of my work, of my professional work. So to give an example, actually my amazing upcoming class this coming fall, invite any students who are interested to sign up for it. In freshwater science and management, we're going to be focusing on a case study that I'm working with a partner in Massachusetts. It's a restoration of an old cranberry bog. Again, informed by this clear understanding of humans as part of the ecosystem, working with a member of the Mashpee Wampanoag people who live very close there, working with them on thinking about the right kinds of plants, medicinal uses, and exploring more of the indigenous knowledge that they have regarding the site. So it's still It has been, and it's been very much in my professional work, in my restoration work, and it still absolutely continues to be a part of it. The aspect here of like saying things like Adolf Hitler, white supremacy, racism, like none of those words feel good. I don't like saying it. I don't like it. I'm gonna be honest. So on that part to your question, no, I don't actually like this. I feel like I can't not talk about it because I've read about it and I'm not happy. And actually, Patricia, Dr. Pedrosa Gonzalez, our very own wonderful professor here, commented so clearly, and I recognize this now. She's like, you want to know what the antidote is to white guilt? It's action. And that's exactly it. So me talking about this and saying, hey, we as a community have a problem that we need to address, does not feel good professionally. I don't like it. I feel very uncomfortable, but it does let me not feel guilty. It does let me feel like I'm doing something that needs, it's like I gotta wash the dishes. Some days I like washing the dishes if the music's really good and I'm happy and nobody's annoying me, but there's a lot of days I don't like that. But I do feel better after like if I don't wash the dishes, I'm gonna feel worse. So this feels like washing dishes. I don't really want to do this. But I'm very driven because I think I'm just so I'm upset at the amount of information that I, as a professional for decades, has not known. And not only, as a professional, but like a professional and an academic, and like my superpower is reading, like that's, I don't run fast. I play terrible music. I mean, I sing to myself and my kids don't like it, but I can read the pants off of anybody. And I've just never known any of this in my own field. And so it's really that it feels much more like a job that I just have to do.
Okay. Well, you're good at it. This was a great talk. And as I said right after you got done, very eye-opening. Lots of things to continue the discussion that I hope people will pick up with you as they see you or email you or take classes from you. But in the meantime, I'd just like to say thanks. It was great. And for the rest of you, and hopefully maybe you, Denise, we will see you next week. And well, we'll see you next week. Thanks again, Denise.
That sounds great. Thank you. Thanks everyone for your questions.